Avoidants go through an emotional metamorphosis when they exit a relationship they are still attached to. In most cases, when avoidants leave their partner, they are tricked by their own traumas into believing that they don't love the person anymore, when in reality, they are still very attached. And this realization always happens sooner or later. The post-breakup journey of an avoidant follows a predictable psychological pattern that almost inevitably leads to their return. Not because they've experienced genuine growth or emotional awakening, but because their attachment system operates on a delayed reaction cycle that makes them crave what they destroyed only after it's been removed from their immediate awareness. Understanding this cycle reveals why avoidants seem to possess an uncanny ability to reappear precisely when you've begun to heal and move forward. Phase 1. The immediate relief and validation period, days 1 to 30. The first phase of an avoidance post-breakup experience is characterized by what psychologists call deactivation euphoria, a flood of relief that validates their decision to end the relationship and confirms their belief that emotional distance was necessary for their well-being. During this period, they experience none of the devastation that anxious or secure individuals typically feel after losing important relationships. The initial 48 to 72 hours often bring a sense of liberation that feels almost intoxicating. Their nervous system, which had been in a constant state of low-level activation due to the intimacy demands of the relationship, finally relaxes into its preferred state of emotional detachment. They may experience increased energy, productivity, and social engagement as they reconnect with aspects of themselves that felt suppressed during the relationship. Week 1 typically involves throwing themselves into activities, friendships, and pursuits that they felt the relationship constrained. They may work longer hours, spend more time with friends who were critical of the relationship, or pursue hobbies that their partner didn't share or support. This hyperactivity serves both as a distraction from potential attachment pain and validation that their independence was indeed being compromised. During the first 2 weeks, they often experience what feels like clarity about the relationship's problems and their decision to end it. They remember every moment of feeling pressured for emotional intimacy, every request for greater commitment, and every expression of their partner's emotional needs that triggered their withdrawal. This selective memory reinforces their belief that ending the relationship was not only correct, but necessary for their psychological survival. The 2 to 4 week period frequently involves subtle or overt criticism of their ex-partner to friends and family, focusing on ways their partner was too emotional, too needy, or too demanding. This narrative construction serves to validate their decision while protecting them from any suggestion that they might have contributed to the relationship's problems through their own emotional unavailability. Throughout this entire month, they experience virtually no conscious longing for their ex-partner or regret about their decision. If thoughts of their ex arise, they're typically framed as relief about no longer having to deal with emotional demands or relationship pressures. They may even feel proud of their ability to move on quickly, interpreting this as evidence of their emotional strength and independence. The absence of immediate pain during this phase often confuses their ex-partners, who may interpret their apparent indifference as proof that the relationship meant nothing to them. However, this initial relief is actually a defense mechanism that temporarily suppresses their attachment needs rather than eliminating them entirely. This phase can extend significantly longer for avoidants who immediately enter new relationships, increase their social activities dramatically, or face major life changes that provide ongoing distraction. Some avoidants can maintain this relief state for 2 to 6 months, especially if they successfully avoid any reminders of their ex-partner or the positive aspects of their relationship. Phase 2. The subtle erosion of relief, months 1 to 4. As the initial euphoria of freedom begins to fade, Avoidants enter a more complex phase where their relief starts to erode gradually, almost imperceptibly. This erosion doesn't begin with missing their ex-partner directly, but rather with noticing the absence of specific benefits the relationship provided that they had taken for granted. The first cracks in their relief narrative often appear around practical matters. They may notice that no one asks about their day with genuine interest, that their living space feels emptier than liberated, or that certain routines feel hollow without their partner's participation. These observations typically register as mild annoyances rather than genuine loss, allowing them to maintain their emotional distance while beginning to experience the first hints of what they've given up. Month 2 often brings their first attempts to replace what their ex-partner provided, whether through dating apps, increased social activities, or deepening other relationships. These replacement attempts serve as unconscious tests of whether they can find the same benefits elsewhere without the emotional demands that their previous relationship required. The comparison process that inevitably occurs during these attempts begins to highlight specific qualities their ex-partner possessed that aren't easily replicated. During months 2 to 3, they may begin to notice their own emotional patterns more clearly as they interact with new people. Other potential partners may seem too eager, too demanding, too emotional, or paradoxically too detached. They start to realize that their ex-partner's combination of emotional availability and tolerance for their avoidant patterns was actually quite rare and valuable. The third month often coincides with their first experiences of stress, loneliness, or challenge without their ex-partner's support. These moments don't immediately trigger missing their ex, but they do create subtle awareness that their support system has been diminished. They may find themselves handling difficulties alone that they previously shared, even minimally, with their partner. Around month 3 or 4, many avoidants begin experiencing what they interpret as general restlessness or dissatisfaction with their current situation. They may attribute this to work stress, seasonal changes, or external circumstances, not recognizing it as their attachment system beginning to signal that something important is missing from their life. This phase also often includes their first conscious comparisons between their current experiences and memories of positive moments from their previous relationship. However, these comparisons typically focus on specific benefits rather than genuine appreciation for their ex-partner as a person. They might miss having someone to share meals with regularly rather than missing their partner's particular conversation style or emotional presence. Sleep patterns, eating habits, and general mood may begin showing subtle changes during this phase as their subconscious attachment system starts processing the loss. However, these changes are typically mild enough that they can attribute them to other factors rather than recognizing them as responses to the relationship ending. Phase 3. The dawning recognition of loss, months 4 to 8. The third phase represents the period when avoidants begin to consciously recognize that they've lost something valuable, though they typically frame this recognition in terms of practical benefits rather than emotional connection. This is when their attachment system's delayed reaction begins to surface, creating the first genuine discomfort about their decision to end the relationship. Month 4 often brings more pointed awareness of the specific ways their ex-partner contributed to their daily life and overall well-being. They may realize that their ex was their primary source of certain types of conversation, shared activities, or practical support. This recognition typically begins with noticing patterns rather than experiencing acute emotional pain. During months 4 to 6, they often encounter situations that highlight their ex-partner's specific value in their life. This might include social events where they notice being single, holiday periods that feel emptier than expected, or stressful situations where they instinctively want to reach out for support, but realize that support is no longer available. The 5th and 6th months frequently coincide with their first genuine moments of questioning their decision. These doubts typically arise not from missing their ex-partner emotionally, but from recognizing that their life has become less convenient, less socially integrated, or less practically supported. They begin to wonder whether the emotional demands they found so burdensome were actually a reasonable price for the benefits they received. Month 6 often represents a turning point where they begin to idealize aspects of the relationship while simultaneously minimizing the reasons they ended it. They may start to remember their ex-partner's positive qualities more vividly, while their memories of feeling pressured or overwhelmed by emotional demands begin to fade. This selective memory shift creates cognitive dissonance about their decision. During months 6 through 8, many avoidants begin experiencing what they might describe as loneliness, though they rarely connect this feeling directly to missing their specific ex-partner. Instead, they may interpret it as general dissatisfaction with their social life, work situation, or living circumstances. This mislabeling of attachment pain helps them maintain their self-image while beginning to experience the emotional consequences of their loss. This phase often includes increased social media monitoring of their ex-partner's activities, either directly or through mutual friends. They may not consciously admit to missing their ex, but they're clearly curious about how their ex is managing without them and whether they appear to be moving on successfully. Sleep disturbances, concentration difficulties, and general mood changes often become more pronounced during this phase as their attachment system continues processing the loss. However, they typically attribute these symptoms to work stress, health issues, or external circumstances rather than recognizing them as manifestations of relationship grief. Phase 4, the phantom relationship syndrome, months 8 to 18. The fourth phase represents the peak period of avoidant regret and longing, characterized by what therapists call phantom relationship syndrome, the tendency to idealize the lost relationship while experiencing genuine grief for what they've given up. This phase typically motivates their first serious attempts at reconnection. Months 8 to 12 often bring the most intense experience of missing their ex-partner that avoidants are capable of feeling. By this point, they've typically exhausted the novelty of independence, failed to find adequate replacements for what their ex provided, and begun to experience genuine loneliness that they can no longer easily attribute to external factors. During this phase, they may begin rewriting the narrative of their relationship, focusing on positive memories while minimizing or forgetting the emotional demands that originally drove them away. Their ex-partner begins to seem like a perfect fit in retrospect, someone who understood and accepted them in ways that new people cannot or will not. The 10 to 15 month period often coincides with major life events, holidays, or anniversaries that trigger acute awareness of their ex-partner's absence. These triggers can create surprisingly intense emotional responses that catch them off guard, forcing them to confront the reality that they may have made a significant mistake. Around the 1-year mark, many avoidants experience what feels like an emotional crisis, where they question not just their decision to end the specific relationship, but their entire approach to relationships and emotional intimacy. They may begin to wonder whether their fears of commitment and emotional vulnerability have cost them the best relationship they're likely to find. Months 12 to 18 typically represent the window when avoidants are most likely to attempt reconnection with their ex-partners. By this point, they've had enough time to forget why they left while retaining vivid memories of what they've lost. Their attempts at reconnection during this phase are often motivated by genuine regret and appreciation for what their ex provided. This phase also often includes their first honest acknowledgement that their emotional unavailability contributed to the relationship's problems. They may begin to see their ex-partner's emotional needs as reasonable rather than excessive, though this insight rarely translates into actual capacity for greater emotional availability. The phantom relationship syndrome creates a psychological state where their lost relationship seems perfect compared to their current reality. They forget the daily friction of having their independence challenged and remember only the comfort, support, and companionship their partner provided. This idealization creates powerful motivation for reconnection attempts. Many avoidants also begin to panic during this phase about their ability to find another relationship that offers the same benefits with someone who will be as tolerant of their emotional limitations. They may realize that their ex-partner's specific combination of emotional availability and patience with their avoidant patterns is actually quite rare in the dating world. Phase 5. The return attempt and cycle repetition, months 18 to 36. The fifth phase represents when avoidants typically attempt to reconnect with their ex-partners, motivated by the regret and idealization that develop during the phantom relationship phase. However, these return attempts rarely represent genuine emotional growth and typically lead to repetition of the same patterns that caused the original breakup. The 18 to 24-month window represents peak return behavior for avoidants, as they've had sufficient time to forget why they left while experiencing maximum regret about what they've lost. Their return attempts during this period often feel urgent and emotionally intense, which can be confusing for ex-partners who remember their previous emotional unavailability. Return attempts typically involve promises of change, declarations of newfound appreciation, and assurances that they now understand what they lost. However, these promises are usually based on their current emotional state, rather than actual development of greater emotional capacity. They may genuinely believe they've changed without having done the inner work necessary for sustainable transformation. The psychology behind their return attempts often involves testing whether they can recreate the benefits of the relationship without having to provide the emotional availability that they found so threatening originally. They're not necessarily trying to deceive their ex-partner, but they may not realize that their fundamental emotional limitations remain unchanged. If their return attempt is successful, avoidants typically experience a brief honeymoon period where they feel grateful for the second chance and motivated to behave differently. However, this motivation usually fades as they become comfortable in the relationship again, and their attachment fears resurface in response to renewed intimacy demands. The cycle typically repeats itself within 6 to 18 months of reconnection, as the same intimacy fears that drove their original departure begin to resurface. They may find themselves feeling suffocated, pressured, or overwhelmed by the same emotional demands that triggered their initial withdrawal, leading to another departure and the beginning of a new cycle. Some avoidants become serial returners, cycling through this pattern multiple times with the same partner or repeating it across different relationships. Each cycle reinforces their belief that they're not suited for long-term commitment, while also validating their attachment to partners who provide security and acceptance. The most psychologically sophisticated avoidants may recognize this pattern and attempt to address it through therapy or conscious effort to develop greater emotional capacity. However, such recognition and motivation for change are relatively rare, as most avoidants find it easier to blame relationship incompatibility than to examine their own emotional limitations. Successful return attempts that don't result in repeated cycles typically require the avoidant to have done significant therapeutic work during their absence or to have experienced major life events that fundamentally shifted their perspective on relationships and emotional vulnerability. The psychological drivers behind the return pattern. Several psychological mechanisms drive the near-universal tendency of avoidants to return to relationships they've ended. Understanding these drivers helps explain why their return attempts are so predictable and why they often repeat the same patterns multiple times. Fear of permanent loss often motivates return attempts more powerfully than genuine love or appreciation for their ex-partner. When avoidants realize that their departure may have been permanent and that their ex is moving on, they experience panic about losing their secure base forever. This fear drives attempts at reconnection that are motivated more by avoiding loss than by positive relationship motivation. The idealization process that occurs during their absence creates unrealistic expectations about what reconnection will provide. They remember the relationship's benefits while forgetting its challenges, leading them to believe that returning will recreate only the positive aspects while somehow avoiding the intimacy demands that drove them away originally. Avoidants also often return because they realize that finding someone else who will tolerate their emotional limitations while providing similar benefits is extremely difficult. Their ex-partner's specific combination of emotional availability and patience with avoidant patterns may be irreplaceable, making return seem like their best option for maintaining access to relationship benefits. The attachment system's delayed reaction means that avoidants often don't experience the full impact of their loss until months after the relationship ends. When this delayed grief finally surfaces, it can be overwhelming and create powerful motivation for reconnection. However, this motivation is typically based on attachment panic rather than genuine capacity for improved relationship behavior. Competition and possessiveness also drive return attempts when avoidants learn that their ex-partners are dating other people or appear to be moving on successfully. The threat of permanent replacement can trigger attachment behaviors that were dormant while they believed their ex would remain available indefinitely. Why the cycle continues: the fundamental unchanged nature. The reason avoidant return attempts typically fail and cycles repeat is that the fundamental psychological factors that drove their original departure remain unchanged. Their return is motivated by missing what they lost rather than developing capacity to provide what their partner needs for sustainable relationship satisfaction. Their core attachment fears, fear of engulfment, loss of independence, emotional vulnerability, and commitment don't disappear during their absence unless they've done significant therapeutic work to address these issues. When intimacy demands resurface in the reconnected relationship, these fears typically trigger the same withdrawal patterns that caused the original breakup. The idealization that motivated their return also sets up unrealistic expectations that the relationship will somehow be easier or less demanding upon reconnection. When they discover that their partner still has emotional needs and relationship expectations, they often feel deceived or trapped, not recognizing that their memories of the relationship were distorted by selective recall. Most avoidants also lack the emotional skills necessary to navigate the complex feelings that arise during relationship reconnection. They may experience guilt about their previous departure, anxiety about their capacity to sustain the relationship, and overwhelm about their partner's emotional needs. Without tools to process these feelings constructively, they often default to their familiar pattern of withdrawal. The return attempt itself often increases pressure and scrutiny on the relationship, as both partners are aware of the previous failure and concerned about preventing repetition. This awareness can create performance anxiety for the avoidant that makes emotional availability even more difficult than it was originally. The ex-partner's role in enabling the cycle. Understanding the avoidant's post-breakup journey also requires acknowledging how their ex-partner's responses often enable the cycle to continue. Many partners of avoidance make the mistake of remaining emotionally available during the avoidant's absence, interpreting their eventual return as evidence of genuine change rather than predictable attachment behavior. Accepting return attempts without evidence of genuine therapeutic work or sustained emotional development typically reinforces the avoidant's belief that they can access relationship benefits without developing greater emotional capacity. If they can leave and return without consequences, they learn that their withdrawal patterns are manageable rather than relationship ending. The hope that motivates accepting return attempts, hope that absence made them realize what they lost, that time apart allowed them to grow, that their return indicates genuine appreciation, rarely aligns with the psychological reality of avoidant attachment patterns. Most return attempts are motivated by attachment panic rather than emotional development. Breaking the cycle. What actually works? The only effective way to break the avoidant return cycle is to require evidence of genuine therapeutic work and sustained emotional development before considering reconnection. This means looking for demonstrated changes in behavior, emotional availability, and relationship skills rather than accepting promises or declarations of newfound appreciation. Healthy boundaries during the avoidance absence, including no contact, dating other people, and building a fulfilling independent life, often provide the best protection against accepting return attempts that aren't based on genuine growth. These boundaries also increase the likelihood that if the avoidant does return, it will be motivated by genuine appreciation rather than convenient emotional regulation. Understanding that avoidant return attempts are predictable attachment behavior rather than romantic gestures helps former partners make decisions based on realistic assessment of change potential rather than emotional manipulation or temporary declarations of regret. The most important recognition is that avoidant attachment patterns typically require professional intervention to change meaningfully. Return attempts that aren't accompanied by evidence of therapeutic work, sustained self-reflection, and demonstrated emotional growth are likely to result in repetition of the same patterns that caused the original relationship failure. Ultimately, the avoidance post-breakup journey reveals more about their attachment system's predictable responses to loss than about their actual capacity for healthy relationship behavior. Their return is almost inevitable, but their ability to sustain emotionally available partnership typically remains unchanged without significant intervention and personal development work.